Okay, welcome to episode 108 of An Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Graham Music. Graham is a psychotherapist, trainer, author, and supervisor. He is a consultant child and adolescent psychotherapist at the Tavistock Centre, where he has worked for over 20 years, and he has been an adult psychotherapist for about 35 years. He supervises and teaches nationally and internationally and has a particular interest in linking cutting edge developmental findings with therapeutic practice. Welcome, Graham.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, thank you for agreeing to speak today. How I'd love to begin the podcast is just around a bit of your journey. What got you into being a psychotherapist? What got you onto this journey?
Well, I suppose my theory is, having um, worked with and trained generations of psychotherapists, is that very often the earliest training is in the nursery, if not at the breast, or if there is one. And that I think I was always interested in other people's minds, thoughts, and feelings. And I think that came from being reared in a family which wasn't completely safe. And so I had to develop a degree of hypervigilance, and I had to work out how to read what people's thoughts and feelings were, what they might be doing next. And so that was always there, but it was always in the interest of self-preservation and survival, which it mostly is with, obviously, it always is with kids. But that gave rise to some skills, which I think I took with me, but that is nowhere near enough to be a psychotherapist. So I suppose I already hinted that in a way, what brought me to it was a deep, passionate interest in other people and thoughts and feelings, but also my own experiences of early neglect and trauma, I think. And then it took me a long, long time till I could dream of becoming a psychotherapist, because I always assumed that nobody would allow me anywhere near their institution or into their trainings. And so I did many, many other things I studied and read and thought deeply and about this stuff. And I worked with homeless people and I worked in housing advice and I looked after people for a while. And then I did a kind of manic late adolescent flight into becoming a I was going to say an antique dealer, but that's grandiose. It was a peddler of bric-a-brac, really. And I used to go around the country, mainly around West Yorkshire, actually, and bits of Lancashire, and buy things. And so I'd find myself in, say, Oldham Market at 6 in the morning, having already bought or not bought whatever I was going to buy, and eating a chip butty as you do in Oldham Market, and reading Freud. And so it's always been my passion. I've always been, or Jung, or whatever it happened to be at the time. And I think it was when I had a bit of a breakdown in my late 20s and went back into therapy again that that got me interested. I had had a period of psychotherapy in my early 20s, and I think so when I went back into therapy after a bit of a crisis, then I dared to get a bit more interested in trusting and started doing courses. And I've done so many psychotherapy courses and trainings over the years. There's been and it may be defensive and it may be passionate, it may be my lack of confidence, but yeah, so I began doing art therapy and a lot of psychodrama, and then I did various forms of therapy. And my initial trainings, my initial formal psychotherapy, 4 year psychotherapy training, was at the Minster Centre, which is much more integrative training, which had quite a lot of body informed stuff in it as well, and quite active and emotionally present. And I knew that's what I needed, because I had spent my life avoiding my body, avoiding my emotions, avoiding anything real. And then I went to the Tavistock, which was much more psychoanalytic. And I think I felt a bit ashamed of my earlier therapeutic trainings and kept it hidden a bit for a while. And it's only probably in the last 10 years or so that I've really actually able to stand up and be proud of my earlier experiences and find a way of integrating it into my way of thinking, my practice, and my being. So there's a potted history of my psychotherapeutic life.
Sounds
And I've
fascinating.
always worked with trauma, always worked with people who have come from backgrounds of really quite extreme complexity.
Mm,
So, so that's always been a passion. And I always felt like I understood often where people are coming from in that respect.
Interesting. Fascinating. I was in Oldham a couple of days ago, actually. I wasn't in the market. So
Is it raining? Nearly
Uh,
always does.
it was, yeah, actually, it was. It was on the way there. It was raining a bit, so how interesting. Yeah. So I'd love for us to maybe begin with trauma. What is in your eyes trauma?
Okay, well, there's a million definitions of trauma, and it's rather a overly bandied about word at the
Mhm.
moment, I think. So you have to be a little bit careful. I think if we think of, I always think about it in terms of like the old original medical definition, like trauma is a kind of piercing, physiological trauma is a kind of piercing of the skin. And I think about it as a piercing of the psychic skin, if you like. So it's that which overwhelms us. So in a way, there's always, we can't go through life without stresses and things that feel a bit scary, or a bit dangerous, a bit difficult, and we develop adaptations to those things. So we might think of those as defenses. So if I'm yearning for intimacy, but my parents can't give it to me, then I might find ways of pushing it back inside myself, or I might. So defenses are different from trauma, and I think trauma are when your defenses break down and you've got almost no way of coping in that moment, or and so there's a kind of psychic. So in a way, that the kind of psychic structure that can develop around defenses against difficult experiences, that can sometimes get people through a life, even if it doesn't feel as satisfactory and rewarding as they would like. I think when real trauma hits, then then often the ability to cope just doesn't hold anymore. So obviously there's different traumas, and we know this, and you've probably had loads of people on the podcast talking about this, but there's one-off traumas, there's big traumas that are absolutely terrifying and horrific, and I wouldn't want anybody to go through, but there's still the one-off traumas, like being in a war, suddenly finding yourself in a war zone, or a massive fire or a hurricane, or those kinds of things. And then there's, of course, the kind of developmental trauma that I know that you're very interested in, the kind of complex trauma that often people suffer if they have major separations and they're in vulnerable situations in which they experience things over time. So maybe trauma or abuse or something horrific over time in an ongoing way, without the kind of psychological capacities to process them, to even know what's going on, let alone to come through them. I wouldn't say unscathed, but even reasonably scathed.
Mm, mm. Thank you. Thank you. I really love your definition there. Piercing of the psychic skin. That's really clear. Um, yeah, I'm aware. I think Gabor Mate talks about shock trauma, developmental trauma, and then the attachment trauma. And when I first read the definition of developmental trauma, it's repeated or prolonged exposure to adversity during development. And I was like, oh yeah, I could relate that to my own experiences of school, of growing up. Um, so I could really resonate with that. Um, do you feel with, trauma? Because I was speaking to someone recently, and often I find we have an experience, say, of boarding school or of a childhood trauma, but say a parent or an adult or a figure kind of denies or dismisses it or somehow says, well, no, that wasn't, it somehow doesn't acknowledge what we've experienced. Um, do you ever come across that sometimes people who've been through an experience are trying to make sense of it, but maybe the parent or the caregiver is not really receiving it?
Yeah, well, I think it's incredibly common, I think, and even though there's more information and understanding of trauma and childhood adversity and major stresses, I think it's very hard for people to understand what's going on unless they've done some internal work and have some understanding of it inside themselves. So I think it can happen for two different reasons. I think it can happen because people can't tolerate their own experiences. So, I happen to be, I think, second, probably third generation of children who were sent away to school quite young. But also my great grandfather, who was born in Russia, was one of 17. He was apprenticed to Fabergé when he was 9 years old. and
Wow.
had to leave, go across the country. And weirdly, that was the age I was sent away to school. So may or may not be a coincidence, who knows? But so in a way, there's this kind of massive intergenerational problem, also transmission of attachment ruptures that goes on a long, long time. And so if you have that, parents like to repeat that because they can't tolerate their own trauma. So obviously there's that. And people don't want to experience the pain of what somebody else has experienced, and so they will push it away. I think sometimes people just can't quite believe it's possible. So sometimes it's much more innocent, it's not defensive. It's a great story, isn't there, about the Dalai Lama when somebody says something like, so what would you advise about to people who really hate themselves and are always criticizing themselves? And he kind of looked and he said, are there people like that? So there's a sense in which if you're this is an anecdote. I think it's true. I don't know, but anyway, you take it as for some people, it just might not be part of their experience
Mm.
that there's such a thing, and so it's quite hard to get your head around.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. I'd love for you to maybe go into your experiences. 9 years old, being sent away to boarding school. How was that for you, Graham?
Well, one of the ways I coped always was by, in a way, being a bit dissociated. So, and dissociation, obviously, it has gradients, it's a spectrum, but one of the things we often see in it is not being as conscious and present with the current moment as I'm coping, which means my memories are a little bit limited. I think what I'll say before I go into the boarding school thing is that actually my life before boarding school wasn't all that great. And so, weirdly, I was brought up on a pig farm with parents of Jewish heritage who, and I was sent to the local school in the local village, and I was literally that thing, that only Jew in the village. And I was subjected to, and also I came from a background with an unstable set of parents, particularly my mother was quite unstable, and I hope it's okay to say this on this podcast. And so there was quite a high degree of instability in my background. And so I was incredibly nervous, incredibly anxious little boy who had very little confidence and hid away, was always the one on the, even in going to nursery, I was always the one on the corner on the edge of a group, kind of looking on, seeing if I can work out how to survive. And so when I hit this school, my well before boarding school, I was a kind of a classic potential victim. Using Beyond's language, I had a valency to be picked on, to be, because I was fragile, I was unconfident, I couldn't stand up for myself. I was kind of perfect for bullies. And some of it was to do with anti-Semitism, but I had a very, very difficult time, and I had a difficult, and nobody knew about it. I mean, I remember sort of break time dreading breaks because I knew I'd have to go out to the playground and I knew I'd get beaten up, and I couldn't tell anybody, and the teacher just told me to get out there and just get on with it, and couldn't tell anybody at home. And it was just it's just unthinkable. I've got a few memories, but it was pretty unthinkable. I had to not be aware of it, really. But that stays in us, that stays in our body, that stays in our beings quite deeply. So the weird thing is that having come from a background of quite a lot of instability, in which I had to cope by shutting down, cutting off, closing down, being very unconfident, being very inwards. And I think I was always an introvert anyway, and kind of hypersensitive. And it's difficult to know what's nature and nurture in that kind of presentation. I arrived in this place with my trunk at 9 years old, and weirdly, so the bad thing is that nobody was interested in what you were thinking and feeling, and it was the one good thing was, in some ways, I wasn't in constant terror of kind of slightly wild happenings, like being beaten up at school or being beaten, or kind of random crazy shouting at home or whatever might have been going on. And so there's a sort of weird experience of, there's something that in psychoanalysis we might think about as a kind of we might think of it as a sort of second skin, if you like, a kind of exoskeleton being held together by something. And so even though I wasn't happy in the school, and even though I was incredibly unconfident still. Um, there's a way in which I was held together by an institutional structure
Mm.
that was a little bit of a relief, weirdly. Yeah, it wasn't a happy place. It wasn't an easy place. Awful things happened. But it was a Jewish boarding school, which was weird. And I'd never met any Jewish people really up until then. And so I wasn't going to get anti-Semitic bullying there. And so it was very, very mixed. And so I could find a way of surviving, which was a sort of full self way of surviving. So it was pretty horrendous. There was all kinds of weird rules and things that happened that shouldn't happen. And, you got beaten with slippers and canes, but not as much as the English public school system. But nonetheless, that happened. And there was sexual abuse, but I actually missed it and didn't even know it was happening. But since leaving, contemporaries of mine have taken people to court. So there was serious paedophilia going on as well. But again, that wasn't part of my experience. So I think that for me, the biggest difficulty was that I didn't even know I was unhappy
Mm.
because I didn't really know what being happy was. So there was kids who would cry when they got a letter from their parents because they so wanted to go home. I didn't want to go home, especially, but I didn't want to be there either. So it was a bit complicated. So I hadn't had a secure enough early attachment to really know that I was missing something important. And that's really helped me a lot, actually, in my work. It's helped me a lot with kids in the care system with whom I worked for maybe 25, 30 years, who often in foster care, foster homes or adopted. And it helped me actually, particularly with at the time when I was working with those kids that were being adopted from Romanian orphanages as well, who
Wow.
were very, 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 very cut off. So, and it got me very interested in this area of emotional neglect as opposed to overt trauma, because in neglect, in a way, you shut in, you close down. I wrote a lot about this I wrote my first paper about neglect, probably about 2000 and I can't remember. Anyway, quite a long time ago. But in this book, Respark, I've written quite a lot about some of the different ways in which you see these shutdown presentations. And it's very dear to my heart because I think it's been too little understood. So in relation to trauma, what we often are working with is the overt traumatic experience, which might overwhelm but it might also be violent, aggressive. A lot of the kids I work with came from backgrounds where there was violence, aggression, shouting, screaming, sexual abuse. I later worked in the Portland clinic where we worked with a lot of sexual perpetrators who also had been sexually abused, not all, but quite often. So there's that background. But there's also what happens when you get nothing good. So those kids in those orphanages who I knew spent their early days in cots on their own with nobody looking at them, let alone picking them up, let alone smiling or talking loving to them, and they would be rocking and they'd be self-soothing, and they were still doing that. So I spent a lot of my time in that school in very defensive states, not knowing I was, because I didn't know what I was defending against. So for example, we had to wear a tie, as one often did in schools in those days, especially those kinds of schools. My tie was constantly being sucked, and so it wasn't recognizable as a tie. And if I saw that now, I think this was a very autistic-like trait, actually. And of course, the thing about autism is it's not the what what you often see in people on the spectrum is the symptom. You have to be careful about using the word symptom these days, but it's the signals or signs of. So I was holding myself together any way I could. And if it was sucking, if it was self-soothing, I mean, so I did anything to hold myself together and to keep out of trouble. And I was really nice to people. And I could smile. I could read their thoughts and feelings well enough because I had to learn that in the cradle. And so I kind of could get by. And within about a year or so, I realized, having been the boy that everybody picked on, I remember sitting, I think it must have been in a service or something, sitting next to somebody and said, "So who are the popular people in this school?" Assuming that I was the least popular boy that ever walked in the school. And the guy said, "Well, I think you are, Graham." And I nearly died, because it was like, actually, I found a way of surviving here and getting through. And one of the things so it was partly that because I had this ability to kind of be there around people and not cause trouble and work out what was needed. So that's great for survival, but it's a full self.
Mhm.
Um, the other bit of it is, I was lucky actually that I was quite good at sports. So I could win races and I was as good as anybody else at football and score the most goals and all the rest of it. And so probably, especially when adolescence hit, I think probably it literally saved my life because there was something I could do that I could feel good about. And also we know about trauma and physicality. And even though, running and stuff is a classic trauma response, but also, it doesn't cure it, doesn't solve the problem, but it alleviates the symptoms and terrible, overwhelming feelings for a bit. And you have the endocannabinoids and the opiates and all the rest of it, they get released. So I had all that. And so there's a way in which I was a desperately unhappy boy who got into loads and loads of trouble, was always getting into trouble with teachers, was unhappy and rebellious, desperate inside. But I didn't know I was desperate inside because nobody knew. Because as Winnicott said, the first sense of self is a sense of self is reflected back. Winnicott said it through the mother's eyes, but I didn't have those eyes, and I didn't have those eyes in school, as very few people did. Nobody knew what I was thinking, feeling, and I bloody didn't. And so I was just getting through and getting by, really, with this kind of fragile full self, I think.
Mhm. Fragile false self. Thank you. You've said a few words there, the exoskeleton. I first noticed mine in my 20s. I'd had a breakdown. I was living in a Buddhist monastery, and I suddenly got this sense that I had this exoskeleton around me that Joy Chavarin talks about, the carapace, or,
Yes.
and it was like, oh my Lord. And as I started to dismantle it, I went into a lot of grief. I couldn't stop
Yeah.
crying. But I really, yeah, I can resonate with that. And the other thing is sport. I was quite sporty as well, and that was one of my releases. I was so angry, and I could
Yeah.
channel it into,
Yeah.
it's like I could disassociate from the pain, so I could tackle someone really hard, and I was fast,
Yeah.
and it was I didn't care if they kicked me in the face. So yeah, because
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I did get angry in school. So there's a thing here that keeps. I'm going to close something down because it keeps making noise. Yeah, got you. So yeah, it's so interesting, and that anger thing. I mean, I was good at football. I couldn't compare it because we weren't allowed to play other schools on Saturdays. So, but I think I was good. I mean, when we went to university, I was also good. I got into the first team and everything, so I know I was good. But the head teacher used to try to get other people to wind me up in
really,
order that I would score the goals. It was like, or the coach would. Yeah, it was like that kind of. When I was angry, I was on fire. And literally that fire, I mean, the fire is energy, and it's hopeful energy in therapeutic language. I mean, in Jungian language, it might be different, and in Buddhist language, maybe not so great. But in therapeutic language, for me, that fire, that energy, that kind of energy coming up and out is a sign of hope. When you're working through trauma, you need to be able to access some of that fire in the belly, some of that anger, rage, hatred, fury about what happened. Then there's the grief, if you like, or sometimes it's the other way around. But for me, it's most effective when there's fire. And if I think about myself as a kind of little kid who was so shy and inward, and it's moving in, the energy is moving inwards. This is moving out and towards, and that is what you see, I think, in more psychologically healthy people. So this anger, which for me sometimes was too strong, got me into trouble, and I wasn't confident physically. I didn't get into fights, and it wasn't that kind of school. But um, but the anger did get me into trouble because I was a desperately, desperately unhappy young adolescent, and so it leaked out. Those bits which weren't contained, held in the sporting activity, etc., or smoking, or whatever it was that one did as an adolescent, it did leak out, and it was years till it came out in such a way that I could process it properly.
fascinating. Yeah, can resonate so much. I was so angry, and I couldn't show it. It was like
Mm,
I drank at school,
yeah,
and when I drank, I did not often, but I did hit the odd person. and headbutt them and things like that. So it was like, but when I wasn't drinking, I was, very dissociated and suppressed. So I could, really resonate with that. I mean, I'd love for us to segue a little bit into what you mentioned there about emotional neglect, because
Mm.
I interviewed David Howe, who wrote the
Oh
book
yeah.
about neglect on the podcast last year. And I just kind of really resonating with what he wrote. And he talks about emotional neglect and how I think it's Neifungin Wickett in 1994 wrote a paper talking about how neglect was even more damaging to the developing child than abuse. And I
Um,
just, yeah, and I just was like, oh, wow. And, Nick Duffel talks about this idea of normalized neglect, that's what boarding school is. And so, I'd love you to talk a bit about, what is the impact of emotional neglect?
Yeah, well, I feel it's quite hard to be passionate about it, weirdly, but I do feel very passionate about it. And interestingly, I mean, I remember doing some talks. He retired quite a long time ago, David, didn't he? So I remember doing a talk with him just around the time he retired in some conference or other, and looking at his book. And I was thinking, I mean, you've got it in front of you, so I'd be interested to know. But I seem to remember that actually the chapter on neglect was much shorter than the chapter on trauma, even though he's taking it seriously. And there's a way in which we can't quite elaborate and think about neglect in the way that we can talk forever about trauma and all the episodes and the incident. And there's something about neglect. First of all, if it happens early, it's much, much, much more pernicious because in a way, it's not the bad things that happen to you, it's the good things that didn't happen to you. And so you might think about it as a spectrum. And so there's the most extreme kind, maybe those, say, Ceausescu orphans in Romania or other. And boarding school life is most definitely on that spectrum. And it comes from not being given in a way, the kind of emotional food and sustenance and light that you need to thrive and grow and develop. And so there's undeveloped things. It's a bit like having a seed, a very kind of that's never properly grown, if you like. And so the thing about overt trauma, when things that happen to you, you're reacting to it. And so, I noticed it in often when I was working. I worked for a long, long time in the Tavistock fostering and adoption and kinship care team, where we really developed some interesting thinking about this stuff. And what I realized was that a lot of the kids that were causing the trouble, that everybody was worried about, the ones that were kicking off, getting into fights, throwing things around, spitting at teachers, getting excluded, those took up everybody's attention, the suicidal ones, whatever. And there was a bunch of kids who nobody was noticing that were shut down, dead, quiet. If you're a teacher, you're only too pleased because there's a few kids who aren't causing trouble. And so you're not going to worry about them too much. Also, your job, the thing about neglect is you close down because you don't believe there's something out there or someone out there in whom you can evoke care, sympathy, interest, curiosity. And so we become deadened not into ourselves, but in terms of, if we think about it from a psychoanalytic perspective, our internal object, if you like, is also deadened and flattened and non-alive. And so if you're in the presence of somebody who's neglected, and that's the primary presentation, then often it's quite hard to care about them or be interested in them. A, they don't have anything very much interesting to say or do. They're flat, they're dead, they're shut down. We can often feel a bit bored in their presence, which I think probably was part of my experience, or partly how I was experienced actually as a kid as well. And so it's like there's things that haven't come alive yet. And I think for that reason, because it's neglected, and it's neglected at a systemic level, it's not just neglected at within individual families. So we used to notice that the cases that didn't get any attention in our team meetings were always the neglect ones or the shutdown ones.
Wow.
And I noticed in supervising people, I would sometimes be, I don't know, running a supervision group for trainee therapists, and suddenly I saw 2 or 3 people yawning in the room, and I was feeling tired myself, and I was thinking, well, so either this is major dissociation going on in the client that's been transmitted, or this is neglect. And I find in my countertransference, which I tend to use a lot to try to make sense of these things, they're a bit different, interestingly. But nonetheless, there's something about So with certain clients that I found in myself that I would kind of dread seeing, and in the sessions I might be bored and might be nodding, but I wasn't really listening. And I was ashamed of this until I realized this makes complete sense, because I'm with somebody who isn't present to me, who doesn't see me as a person who's interested in them, who hasn't got that belief in their deep in their cells, really, that there's such a thing as a person who could be interested in them, that they could be interesting. And so when you're in the presence of somebody who's not treating you as a human being, if you like, properly, then we don't feel alive ourselves. And it's the lack of aliveness. So there's different kinds and ranges of neglect. And you've been particularly interested in the kind of neglect that happens in boarding school. And I think it's a very, very specific kind. It's similar at one level, because again, all these potential emotional capacities don't come online properly, because and if you have a parent who sends you to boarding school at 7 or 9 or 11 even, the chances are there's a way in which they're out of touch with your emotional needs at that point already. So you probably had that background already. And then you're in an environment where to survive, you had to even more not show emotion, not show feeling, not be aware you have feelings. So that's a profoundly impressive survival strategy, but it comes with terrible, terrible costs, I think. And I think there's deep, deep, deep despair, often a suicidal despair beneath the surface.
Yeah, yeah, that dissociation. I think for me, age 11, when I showed emotion, the dormitory, they all came in and started shouting at me because I was crying. It was that inner hatred. And so whenever I showed emotion, it was that hating myself for being an emotional
Yes.
being. And that inner critic that Pete Walker talks about in his book, Complex PTSD, really comes
Yeah.
in line that you're a piece of shit. And I kind of, yeah, can resonate with that. What else are some of the signals which might present themselves, if we have been neglected, that might show themselves?
I'd like to come back to what you just said, Piers, as well,
Mm, sure.
before, after, make sure we do in terms of, the self-hatred and the
Mhm.
self-attack. But I think it's a kind of dullness, a lack of enthusiasm, and lack of confidence, a turning inwards, moving away from life. You often see in things like skin tone, dead eyes, lack of liveliness in the body.
Wow.
And and
Yeah.
there can also be a sort of sometimes, obviously there's not one thing called neglect, and so I think some of the boarding school people that I've known, they had a kind of muscularity around them as well. So in a way, there's a kind of, again, using the term I think Bjorn used first, that Joy uses, about a carapace, that often is a kind of a carapace of strength, but inside this collapse. So the great, very early body therapists used to talk about this. I mean, there's a Wilhelm Reich talked about these kinds of almost masochistic character structures, and it's a guy called Stanley Kellerman that people might know of. I don't know. He was a brilliant genius of a body psychotherapist, worked with Reich, and he's got books where he's got pictures, and you can see the body, and you can see what looks like strength on the outside and collapse on the inside. And bloody hell, I know that inside myself as well. So you that's it. And so in the boarding school, particularly upper or upper middle class boarding school survivor, I think you have it. It's peculiar because that also comes with um, a sense of entitlement and superiority, and so, which actually, it's got its advantages for sure, and it obviously is a defense in part, but also it's like, this is what you're taught to be the leaders of the next of the country, and it does help survival in the world for sure. But again, the emotional costs I have no idea of. But you wouldn't want to be ruled by too many, and we have been by too many, as Nick Duff and other people have said. There's too many of these people who are so out of touch with their emotions, so out of touch with the vulnerable, and so the vulnerable in themselves, which means the vulnerable in society, which often means women and children and the traumatized people, and the people who are neglected by society, the people who are disenfranchised, etc. So it comes with a degree of splitting,
Mm.
that kind of superiority. So I'm good, I'm the best, you're not. And so splitting is a very successful psychic mechanism, good and bad. We're seeing so much of it in the world at the moment. But I think in boarding school survivors, we often see that. I'm good, you're bad, I'm the best. We don't need to go too far at the moment. We're hearing about the American elections and we see some of this stuff from one of the candidates. So
Which is interesting. He's a boarding school survivor.
I
So.
don't think I knew that. How interesting. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Fascinating. So um so the other stuff, I want to go back for a moment to what you were saying about the self-attack and self-hatred,
Mm.
because I think on the one hand, it's possible that we internalize the anger and aggression that might be directed towards us. Say we'd be shouted at or criticized or judged quite a lot. And that part of my background was that. So then I will internalize that. But also it can happen in neglect as well, because so I'm most fond of the theory of somebody called Ronald Fairbairn, who was around before Melanie Klein, a contemporary of his, and this idea of the kind of the moral defense, which is it's better to be bad in a world ruled by God than good in a world ruled by the devil. So if you think of attachment theory, your primary job, according to Bowlby, is to retain proximity to your attachment figure, whatever they're like. So there's no such thing as a bad attachment style. So if my parents are avoid emotions, I will make sure I don't express any to stay safe, to be able to stay alive, basically. And so if I'm shouted at, or if I don't get what I feel I need, then as a child, I can't blame my parents. And you might once you hit adolescence, but as a child, you don't. And so time and time again, you blame yourself. It must be my fault. So you keep, so in a way, it's the opposite of the kind of splitting you might see in the work of people like Melanie Klein, which is the most common form of splitting, which is the bad's out there, the good's inside me. In this form of splitting, you see the opposite, which is the good's out there, my parents. And so it must be something wrong with me because I'm not getting what's good and I don't feel good in myself. And that is so hard to work with because that just gives rise to cycles of self-abuse, self-neglect, self-criticism, judgment.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I've had a few aha moments. As you were speaking there about neglect, you mentioned about that loss of life and becoming kind of dead. And I was thinking, when I was 13, I hurt my back at school, so I've stopped playing sport. And for a year, I just sat on my bed reading horror novels. And I became that. I became flat, my body crumpled. And I used to say to people, I'm boring. And people would come up and make fun of me, the older boys going, let's go and speak to, I changed my name at school to Simon. And because I didn't want to get bullied for being called Piers. And they would say, oh, Simon, so do you think you're boring? He says, yeah, I'm boring. And so just that's really come to me. That's because of the neglect. There was no one for me to talk to, no one to share with.
Yeah. So in a way, you weren't brought back into life. So there's different kinds of flatness. Of course, there's the flatness of extreme trauma, which has become so popular in terms of the, I don't know, things like polyvagal theory these days, which, dorsal vagal response. So, but obviously, if there's a lion coming towards you or a predator or 10 bullies or guys with knives, then the best thing to do is to go flat and utterly still, which I learned actually in my primary school more than in my boarding school. And so that is a survival mechanism, but it's a kind of deadening, shutting down. It's extreme last resort form of defense, which is, but there might have been before that, in a way, a bit of life in somebody that then got shut down. And if that happens regularly, then it becomes default. It becomes what Seligman described as learned helplessness.
Mm.
Don't you remember the experience with dogs who no longer would?
Yeah, get out of the cage, even though they've
Yeah, yeah.
neglected
So
to.
people start living their lives, but then they didn't necessarily start their lives like that. Whereas with neglect, often that's the default position. And so it's like they're shutting down. It's like they've never opened up. Anna Vares, who's a child psychotherapist, talks about people who are undrawn as opposed to withdrawn, which I think is a very nice metaphor. So if you think about if there's danger, we might close up, a bit like plants close their leaves when there's not enough light, or where there's, the mimosa pudica closes its leaves when it senses danger. So all human defenses are a bit like that, animal defenses, mammalian defenses. And so there's a closing down. But actually, if you never opened in the first place, it's much damn harder to get those leaves opening.
Mm. What can we do? What do you do? Notice reading your website, this idea of transformation. Well, how do we? So if we've been through emotional neglect, whether that was at school or that was as a child, how do we bring that side of ourselves back to life? That.
Well, we don't do it on our own, I don't think. I think we need some help.
Mhm.
And I think you need somebody skilled enough to be able to recognize what, I suppose, what kind of shutdown am I in touch with in this moment? Obviously, if I have somebody who's very borderline and jumping around and shouting and screaming, then we know there's a need for emotional regulation. If somebody comes to me very, very shut down, I need to know whether that's as a result of shut down after serious trauma with a dissociative element to it, or whether it's kind of somebody who's never quite come alive. Because in the first case, I mean, in all cases, but particularly if there's been dissociative shutdown after trauma, we absolutely need to help people feel safe in their bodies. So that has to be the starting point. So this idea of safeness, feeling some sense of ease, and also more ability to be in touch with bodily signals and bodily states is really, really, really crucial. So it's one of the reasons why I think one of the reasons why many of the practices in the Buddhist and other traditions are so helpful. If you sit with your body and be aware of sensations and then be aware of the feelings. And so one of the classic early responses to trauma, of course, is to shut down awareness. That's the point of it. If I'm being sexually abused, I don't want to have to know what that feels like. It might be better if I'm outside my body. And so coming back into the body in a way which is safe must be the beginnings of the therapeutic work, which is a bit different to neglect, where I think you can kind of, in a way, get sort of almost like prod people back a little bit with a bit of teasing, joyfulness, fun, reciprocity, that kind of thing. So it's a slightly different thing. And you have to be careful about that with people who are traumatized in a more dissociative way. But then it never stops there, because there always has to be, underneath the surface, we always have to try to find the feelings about what happened, if you like. So when I feel safe, now I can confront in my mind the perpetrator or whoever did whatever they did. And then I might need to begin to experience the things we were talking about before, the heat, the rage, the anger, those kinds of things. And the grief that might come after that as well. So I think it requires a degree of skill, and I don't want to say I know anybody knows how to do this, me or anybody, but I think a degree of skill to try to work out what might be needed with this particular person in this particular moment. And thankfully, we're all completely different, and it's not like there's an A, B, C, D, E pathway. There never is.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really like that. Coming into the body, feeling safe, and then once we're in that space, then to explore those emotions. I mean, one of the things I noticed a lot with childhood trauma, certainly in boarding school, is that dissociation. But then
Mm,
the issue is, I notice with people, is then to reconnect. They can't reconnect to their feelings.
yeah,
It's like they can't cry again, or you know, maybe they can cry, but they can't feel joy. They
yeah.
can't locate it. One of the monks I lived with, who was also at boarding school, he mentioned when he first learned meditation in the 80s, the teacher said, "Now I want you to feel your legs." And he was like, "Nope, nope, can't feel them. I can't feel them." And he realized, oh, I've got an issue. I'm not embodied. I've gone.
Yeah.
What can we do if someone comes to you who's split off like that, can't even feel their body? Are there things?
Yeah. Well, I would always, so if I'm getting a hint of a feeling, so in somebody, then I would all straight away go to where what's happening in your body now. And often there's quite a lot of psychoeducation that needs to take place in order to help people begin to develop some sense of interoception, really to read their body's signals. And I think what's important is that nobody feels that they're doing anything wrong by not being able to do it. I mean, I'd want to say to that person, how brilliant for you that you managed to survive by not having to feel things you didn't want to, that wouldn't have been very helpful to feel at the time. But now we can begin to change that step by step, I think. And so when you think of that, whatever it might be, a teacher or perpetrator, what do you feel? And more importantly, what do you feel towards them might be a very good question, because then you can see whether somebody's ready to actually want to kill the bastard, or whether actually, no, it wasn't his fault, or it's such a long time ago. I don't, I've forgiven him now. Those would all be defensive responses, because the more primary feelings are too painful to face. So it has to be slow, it has to be gradual. There's no one size fits all, but it's always got to be that mixture of emotion and body, and also understanding the process. So cognition has a role, but the role isn't in making clever interpretations. It's, did you see that when I asked you what you felt, you moved away and you couldn't look at me, as if it was too difficult. So that's the cognitive bit of education. And then, so how about if you sit back now and look at me now and try to tell me what you feel? So it brings it back into the present, what's going on in your body, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I really like that. Becoming more somatic, kind of connecting into the body. Uh,
Mm,
yeah, yeah. And I do see that I became, and I see that people who've been through that type of education become very cerebral.
yep,
We live in our heads. And
yep,
often it's like Nick Duffel talks about timetabling. We can't stop, and we can't stop at work. But so what we learned, it can't stop because we can't connect to the body and go, actually, my body's exhausted. I just need to, cry or grieve or
yeah. Well, if when you needed to do that, it didn't feel possible. There was nobody there who could hold you in that place. So Winnicott wrote this absolutely brilliant paper, I don't know, probably in the 1940s, called Mind and its Relation to the Psychosoma, that you might know of. And he talked about how when things are going well, the psyche comes to reside in the soma. In other words, you have a kind of psychosomatic unity when you feel emotionally held. And that some people don't get that experience. And I suspect many upper middle class English people, and also many Jewish people of Jewish heritage, which was my heritage, who relied a lot on their heads, didn't have that experience of feeling safe and just being held. And so they moved into their heads, and their heads were what they relied on rather than the external mother, father, kindly figure that they needed, who could become an internal figure. And so it's great. It can make you very clever. You can do well in school. You can pass exams. You might be good at leadership, all kinds of things like that. But actually, it's a full self thing, and it's got limits. And so what Nick Duffel described in terms of this kind of perseverative thinking, going round and round in circles and always wanting to be on things, it's a way of staying in control, because the opposite is falling apart. And so Winnicott, and actually Francis Tustin, who works a lot with autistic children, always talked about this Winnicottian idea of the terror of falling forever. And I think a lot of the running away from trauma experience and facing it is that fear. It's a bit like the Tom and Jerry cartoon um, when the mouse is running over the edge and then keeps moving their legs, and then they're going to fall.
yeah.
And we're going to fall because those defenses, they're not enough to live the life that we need to live.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Brilliant. So we've been talking about 50 minutes. I mentioned I thought it would go quickly.
Good therapeutic hour. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I would love for us to talk a little bit about cultivating resilience, moving into, you know, moving forward, like how we can heal, how we can, if we've had childhood trauma, boarding school syndrome, what can we do to start creating resilience, more joy in our lives, more, you know, inner contentment?
$1 million question. I can't really answer it in a very simple way. I do think that resilience, the point of resilience is that it's growth from stressor. So, I just went to the gym before coming here. And so I put my muscles under a bit of stress, maybe not enough. And hopefully there'll be a bit of growth from that, as opposed to if I just sat in my bed for the afternoon. And so no child is going to be emotionally healthy if everything works out perfectly for them. And so we know that growth depends on things going a bit wrong and then being repaired. So mismatch and repair or rupture and repair, however that's described in the developmental literature. And the more traumatized we are, the less we're able to bounce back from something. So in my experience of working with kids who've been very traumatized, it was the ones who came from the worst backgrounds who practically never dared answer a question in class. So if they asked it once and it was wrong, they didn't put their hand up again and they didn't keep trying. And if it was the day to go out on an outing, or if there was a supply teacher, they got all over the place because they couldn't roll with the changes. Whereas a secure child, the world is generally basically deeply safe. And so if somebody says, let's go off on an outing, yeah, great. Because these kids, they might pretend to feel excited, but actually they'll be inside, they'll be terrified. And so what I think that means is that we have to work one step at a time within specific limits and capabilities. And so for me, so I often use the metaphor with working with adoptive parents of kids from traumatized backgrounds, which is that they would often say, well, he just won't sit still for 10 minutes. And he's not doing nearly the same as all the other kids in his class. And I would say, well, when he came to you, how long could he sit still for? Well, maybe 20 seconds, that kind of thing. And so every step is an important, vital step that needs to be really deeply valued. And so there does need to be some risk taking, but you need somebody holding your hand or with their hand on your back in order to do that, whether it's a good friend, therapist, partner, whatever, coach. But I think that the growth comes from taking a risk that isn't too big, but it's not too small. And that's $1 million question. What is that risk? So for me, for some people of my clients, being able to be in touch with the sadness of being abandoned as a child, just a bit of that sadness would be like another person walking up Everest. You can't compare, say one is more of an achievement than the other. And many people who walked up Everest, of course, were boarding school survivors who couldn't have ever done that crying as well. And so it has to be a step at a time. And I think we kind of know in ourselves when we're ready to be pushed a little bit, and sometimes we don't quite dare, and sometimes we do dare. But I think the big gestures, I don't think are always that helpful. And I think for the same reason, I think a lot of the kind of retreats and things people do, they can be great as beginning things, but people often then retreat back to their old defenses. I think a step at a time, solid growth is what I believe in, really.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that's really answered you,
Yeah,
but
beautiful. Yeah, and I so agree. I think sometimes we can go off to a retreat, do a Vipassana, Goenka style, 10 days, but then we come back to the same point. And
Yeah,
actually, it's the incremental growth day after day. This is something I do with my clients. We have a daily practice, right? Do it every day. And then suddenly, after a few months or a few years, you're like, oh my God, I'm up here.
yeah,
How did I get up
yeah,
here?
exactly. So I've got clients who just about ready to leave therapy now after a while, and it's like one of the metaphors I've often used is like they're trying out new ways of being, and it's a bit like doing something with your non-dominant hand.
Mhm.
And to start with, it feels utterly awkward, crazy, doesn't feel natural. I'll never be able to do this. And soon it can becomes more like the default way of being in the world. And it's really exciting when that can happen. But it's often only in looking back. It's like you might be three-quarters of the way up the mountain or even a quarter of the way up. You don't think you've gone anywhere at all. And then you look down, you've come pretty far. This is impressive. This is good.
It's almost like, and I see this a lot with trauma survivors. I can't remember the name of the lady. Call of the Wild is her book, but she says it's so important for us to feel the positive feelings. So often, as a trauma survivor, we might, um, have positive experiences, but then we don't stop. Oh, I'll get to that later. I'll celebrate that later. And that never comes. To actually just stop, turn back, look down.
So I think that's so important. And I'm historically been a very, very bad example of that. So I remember when I first went to this boarding school and I was good at running, and I remember seeing the guy in the year above me who won the senior race, whatever it was. And he was looking, had a big smile on his face. And I was thinking, why are you smiling? You should have won. And if I won a race, I would think, well, should have won. I'll probably lose the next one. And that is so sad for me, I think. And so being able to um, suppose bathe in the positivity and the hope and allow it. Because for me, and it's not the same for everybody, but certainly for me and for many people I've worked with, the fear of celebrating that is I daren't take this for granted because something else is going to go wrong around the next corner. Obviously people can do it defensively and celebrate too much when they shouldn't. That's another form of defense. But I do think that celebrating those little gains is really, really important. So how did it feel that you did that? That's amazing. Is just stay with that because and of course, otherwise, what often happens is the self-criticism starts firing back again, and they start taking themselves down. Yeah, so I think it's really important. And
Mm,
that, again, it has to be an embodied experience of it. So
yeah.
when you're excited, where does that feel? How do you feel that?
Yeah, it's a practice I do with my clients. We'll check in and then I get them to put their hand on their heart and I just invite them to bless what they've done. It's like bless the person under these hands for how they've shown up this last week. And where do you feel that? And it's like, oh, it's
Yeah.
my heart, it's my stomach. So they can actually start to physically, somatically feel, oh yeah, oh yeah. So yeah. So you know, I as we start to wrap this conversation, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much, Graham. What
Fun.
final thoughts, as we've spoken, would you love to share with the audience today?
I don't think I've got any final words of great wisdom or anything. I think that, I mean, one of the things I've learned at the ripe old age of 67 now is that it's a never ending journey and we're constantly learning. And if you're doing the kind of work that we're doing, then it's time to hang up the boots if you're not interested anymore. There has to be passion, curiosity, interest. And it's a bit like meditating, like the breath. I mean, how interesting can the bloody breath be? Yet again, on the other hand, there's going to be something interesting and fascinating around every corner. And that's what makes it important and hopeful, I think. And paths are not straightforward, unfortunately. I wish they were. So it's a bit like snakes and ladders, this world, life, and this business, which is there's gonna be falls, you're gonna slide back down again, and you have to crawl your way up in those resilient ways. But it's very exciting. I mean, I wish I was for all kinds of reasons. I wish I was 30 or 40 years younger. So I think this whole field is going to be changing so dramatically if the world doesn't blow itself up or we don't have massive eco disaster. Then the therapeutic world is going to change very dramatically. I think we're on the cusp of quite major paradigm shifts. I don't think we'd even be calling it therapy at some point in the future. And it's exciting. So staying open to possibilities and not thinking we know it all, for me, that's the most important thing.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So people wanting to buy your books, where's the best place to connect to you? Is there,
Okay,
have you seen
great.
your
So
website?
I have, yeah, I've got a website. So the website is going to shortly have a Shopify page or something where you can buy the book. So we can always go to the usual places like Amazon. But um, I also have a newsletter which comes out monthly, which people can subscribe to, and that will have news. Not It's not just about me at all. I kind of review books and have interesting things, interesting podcasts and stuff like that in it as well. And occasionally a very bad joke and cartoon and things. But it's
You got any good jokes now to tell me? I do love a good joke.
oh well, my worst jokes are all Jewish jokes, but
I've
I'll
got a
try.
good one. I've got a good one if you like.
Go on
Okay.
then.
This was a 7-year-old girl who told me this. What does Count Dracula take when he's got a cough?
What does he take when he gets a cough? When he has a cough?
Coughin medicine. I found that really funny. Everyone's like, "Oh my God, that's terrible, Piers." And I'm like,
I
"Oh,
like that. It might make it into the next newsletter.
perfect." I don't know who the girl was. It was doing a bag pack with Scouts, so I wouldn't be able to tell you who wrote the.
I'll describe it to you. That's great. Oh, well, yeah. So the newsletter, please, and do subscribe. And also, I'm beginning to do a few courses online courses about child development. So I'm going to try to keep those very cheap, based on since I'm no longer doing my usual old lecture series that I did for years at the Tavistock. I thought I'd shove a few things into online courses, and I'm making those available as well. And there's events, but all that stuff will be in the newsletter and on the website. So,
So
and feel
that's
free to,
nurturingnatures.co.uk.
yeah,
Brilliant. I've got that in the description, so please do, guys, go and read Graham's books and join the newsletter. So
great.
it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today, Graham.
Been fun, enjoyable, and interesting to talk to you, Piers. Thanks so much.
Okay, take care.